Hallå, hörs det? Ja. Jag säger också välkomna till er. Det här samtalet kommer ske på engelska. Och det kommer bli möjlighet till frågor mot slutet. Och om det är någon som känner sig obekväm att fråga på engelska i ett större sällskap så här, så får ni gärna ställa frågorna på svenska, så översätter jag. So, nice to see you again, Cecilia. Very welcome here to this talk at the Gothenburg Book Fair and this museum.
Thank you.
I don't know if everybody in the audience knows about you, but you have published in Sweden 4 books. This one, La Peregrina, is the latest one, but you have 3 other books that hasn't yet been translated, and you're, I gather, writing the sequel of this one, which will make it a trilogy.
That's correct.
And you are a very best-selling author in many countries in the world, and I want to start by asking.
Hopefully that will be true. I'm very successful in Norway so far, and really gaining popularity in other countries.
In other countries too, I know.
I hope that happens. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Cecilia, when did you first realize that you were an author?
Well,
I know you have another training. You're a trained psychologist and therapist.
Absolutely, yes. My training is in psychology. I have worked as a psychotherapist with families and couples and children for 20 years, and in primarily the inner city of Los Angeles. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Cuba, and I grew up in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is the gateway for many immigrants throughout the world. So I felt a calling early in my life to work with people who had experienced something similar to what I had experienced. I thought that I would be able to help them. And so I actually think that has been a great training ground for a writer, because I've heard the most amazing stories from my clients who have experienced incredible trauma in their lives, stories of triumph and suffering and devotion. And they inspired me. Their stories really became part of me. Here I was hoping to help them, and in so many ways my clients have given me so much. That at somewhere in my mid-30s, I thought, I started to entertain this idea of writing. And it seemed to me that I was drawn to fiction. I've always been drawn to fiction. I think that sometimes it's easier to express what your truth is and what your belief is within fiction than it is nonfiction. And so it just evolved from there, and it grew from there. In terms of when I actually thought of myself as an author or a writer, sometimes I still don't really see myself as an author or a writer.
What are you then?
I see myself much more as a storyteller.
Okay.
And I think there is a distinction between an author and a storyteller. And this is my definition. I certainly don't impose this on anyone else. But I think that the way that I see it, an author is much more focused on perhaps the words and the work itself. Whereas a storyteller, the emphasis is more on the reader. So what is the impact that what is the story going to have on the reader? What is the message of the story? And I think that's very much in keeping with my background as a therapist as well. That I hope that my stories will encourage readers to reflect on their own lives, their own relationships, their own journeys.
Well, first reflect on the stories that are told by you, I think.
Sure. Yeah. Certainly to experience the story itself, but for it to go further than that. That's my goal. That's what I strive to do.
Do you think it's important to tell stories about people's lives?
I believe that stories have the power to change our lives. I think stories have the power to heal us in many ways, and to even transform us. The certain stories, those stories that reach deep into the soul and again, connect you with other people in a very deep way and other experiences. They open the world.
You mean read and hear other people's stories, but also trying to collect and tell your own story?
Yes, it is. It's a way that we share our truths, our deepest beliefs about life, about what matters, and I think that it's important that we do that with each other, and not just within the context of publishing, but just in day-to-day life. And many of the characters in my stories, my books, are telling each other their stories. They're stories within stories, and these stories are changing their lives.
Yeah. They meet and confront the other people's stories. They tell their stories and hear the other people's stories.
And in listening, they are. It is as important to listen actively and really be present as it is to tell a story from an honest place, from a vulnerable place. And that can be a frightening thing to do in today's world, where there's so much technology, there's so much distraction, there's so many ways that we can employ our time that simply telling a story or listening to someone isn't as easy, or we don't have as many opportunities, I suppose, as we used to.
We don't take those opportunities, so we don't arrange them, perhaps. Many of the stories that are told in your books by your characters are sad stories or passionate stories. It's burning love, it's also burning hatred. It's very intense. And I thought is that a question of culture? Is it because some of these people come from a Latin culture, or that's why those characters are so passionate? Or can everybody be as passionate? I say we Swedes are considered a very dull and peaceful and silent kind of human beings, but might we be as passionate as your characters?
Oh my theory is absolutely yes. And my theory is that there are certain styles within a culture, ways that people learn to communicate. But deep beneath that stylistic way that we learn to communicate with each other. For example, in my family, we gesticulate a lot with our hands. It's very difficult to not talk without our hands, and that's true of many Latino cultures.
And your neighbors, your pure American neighbors, North American neighbors, what did they say when you were just gesticulating?
I grew up in a very mainstream American community, and we were quite literally the only Latin family in that neighborhood, in that community. And I would have American friends who would come to the house, and my parents would have come home from work, and they would be talking in Spanish just about the day, what was going on, and they could get very passionate about what had happened at work and what was the price at the grocery store and whatnot. And my friends would listen to them, and to me it was normal. My friends would listen to them, and I'd notice they'd get kind of afraid, and they'd say to me, "What's wrong with your parents?" And I say, "Nothing. Nothing's wrong." They said, "Why are they fighting?" I said, "They're not fighting. They're actually just talking about the day." And it was such a revelation to me at that point. And I realized that it was just a different style of communication. But beneath that style, I think people are people. What makes most of us laugh in one community makes us laugh in another. What makes us cry makes us cry. At that very fundamental emotional core, we are very much the same. I truly believe that.
And is it also true that telling the story of your feelings, of your sadness, your grief, will help you in any way? Is it something that you don't only do at a therapist's office, or is it something that you do in the Cuban family as well, with your hands?
Yes. Well, as a therapist, I would definitely say it's important to confront all of your feelings and validate them. Absolutely. That's feelings and thoughts, and to integrate that and to work through that. But I don't think I think there are many ways in which we can experience our feelings and get to know ourselves better with our friends, within our families, reading, experiencing and thinking about and reflecting on certain books, and not just heavy books or books about sad things, but even lighthearted and funny books can really touch us in deep ways and get us to think. So there are many avenues. There are many avenues in which people can look at themselves and be honest with themselves. But it can be scary sometimes. It can be to be vulnerable and to look at that aspect of life. And
that's perhaps why a book can be a very good vehicle, sort of. To read a book is not as scary as to confront your friends with your deep feelings.
It's true. I think books can be. I know that when I was growing up, I often felt very isolated because I at first didn't speak the language that my peers spoke, and it took me a couple of years in school. But books were my friend. You know, I felt very comforted when I was able to read a story and immerse myself in a different world. And it at first felt like an escape, but looking back, I realized it was a way that I was coming into myself, learning about the culture, learning about people. It was an important part of my development as a human being. And I think it is for many people who love books and have felt that soulful connection to a story or to characters.
And now you're writing books with characters who tell their story, often very sad stories, but also stories of healing and growth and success.
Well, there is, I don't think there's any way to really experience the great joys in life without confronting the inevitable suffering in life. That's certainly true for my characters. And that's what life is about.
And it's true for yourself?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Great sadness. I don't know who it was that said, it might have been Hemingway, who said that you can't really write a novel until you have truly suffered. And having an awkward adolescence does not qualify. there has to be something a little bit more than that.
More than that.
And I think that there's some truth to that, you know.
Well, let me take another track, the track of pilgrimage. The title of this book, La Peregrina, it's Spanish and means the female pilgrim. What do you know about pilgrims and pilgrimage? Part of the book, this book takes place in northern Spain, where there's a very well-known cathedral in Santiago de Compostela. And what do you know about that?
Well, Santiago de Compostela, I really think of it as my spiritual home, and I know that many people throughout the world share that feeling for Santiago de Compostela. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to go there at some point in your life. There's something very mystical about that place, and it's very hard for me to describe it. It's something that must be experienced. It's close to my heart because my grandfather, who was probably one of the greatest influences in my life, and who was the most amazing storyteller I ever knew, he was from that part of Spain. And I grew up hearing about life in Galicia, which is that northern western province of Spain. He came from a very poor family. He was a shepherd, but he had wonderful adventures out in the wilderness, or el monte, in the hills, guiding his sheep around. And he told me about the pilgrims, because this is a pilgrimage that has been walked since the Middle Ages. And of course, when he was there, and he was born in 1898, I believe, or maybe earlier than that. But he knew of the pilgrims then, and he'd watch them go through. He never was able to do the pilgrimage himself, but some years later, I went to that part of the world that he had told us about, and I saw the pilgrims myself, and I learned more about the pilgrimage. And I decided that I wanted to do a portion of the pilgrimage myself, and thankfully I was able to persuade my husband to come with me. And I was starting to write the first book of the trilogy at the time, Señor Peregrino. And I went...
Means Mr. Pilgrim.
Mr. Pilgrim. This man who's telling the story so identifies with the experience of pilgrimage that he actually sort of renames himself Mr. Pilgrim. And in fact, I'm digressing a little bit, but people who have done the pilgrimage it's not unusual, it's become such a part of their life that at the time of their deaths they insist on being buried in the walking clothes that they wore. This is something that is not that uncommon. I'm not sure I'm going to take it to that extent.
Well, what about you?
I'm not sure I'm going to be wearing my boots at that point. But anyway, this, what was I talking about? I do this a lot. So, Santiago de Compostela, the pilgrimage.
Well, what did you learn from it? What did you yourself experience?
I remember now. So I started off...
You started off as a pilgrim.
Started off as a pilgrim, but I went with just purely research motives. You know, I figured if I'm going to write a story about someone who's...
As an author you can do, or journalist, you can do lots of things.
Yes.
Just out of, I have to do this research.
Exactly.
But was it more for you then, or...?
I started out really with that intention. I thought, if I'm going to write about this, I've been to that part of Spain, but I've never walked 20, 30 miles every day for 2 weeks, which is what we did. And I knew intuitively, as I'm sure you're all thinking, that can change you. It's something. It's really incredibly arduous, much more than you would think. Very painful, even for people who are very fit. And I wasn't very fit, but I was okay. I was healthy, but I didn't realize how painful it was. And it became for me something much different than I expected it would be. And the pilgrimage is something very different for everyone, but I do believe that everyone that has done the pilgrimage starts out thinking it's going to be one thing, and it becomes something else for them. It becomes something transformative, and it deepened my appreciation for the journey of life. I felt a sense of connection to, this sounds rather cliche, and forgive me, but it is true. I felt the connection to the world in a way that I hadn't before, because this is a pilgrimage where people from all over the world are walking, and usually for a reason. Something has happened in their lives, or something they're striving to do. Perhaps we met a man who was walking because his wife was very ill, and he was a man of great spiritual faith, and he was doing this as a sort of prayer and a plea to God to heal his wife. And I remember him very well. He was a German man named Max, and very stoic and walking on his own. Would converse very little with people. This was a very important journey for him. And other people had perhaps gone through a divorce, or they were close to retirement, or they were making a great change in their life. So if you can imagine walking on this path, which is really like a river of humanity, and meeting people that you've never seen and may never meet again, and asking them the question, which is the question that's going to open them up, and that is the natural question to ask in those circumstances. Why are you doing the Camino? And that would open up such a conversation, stories, incredible stories. And then you would part ways, because everybody walks at a different pace. And it's important when you're walking the Camino that you walk at your own pace, not at somebody else's pace, not even if it's your husband. You know, sometimes I wouldn't see my husband all day. He would be walking several paces ahead of me, and we'd meet for lunch somewhere, and that was a beautiful thing, and we had to accept that. So then you would say buen camino at the end of that soulful conversation, which means have a good walk, but it really means have a good life and be on your way. It was a time when you felt so sort of understanding and at peace with yourself, and yet so connected with other people from all over the world. Whenever I have the opportunity to talk about the Camino, I encourage people to consider doing the pilgrimage. I think it's incredible. This, in about a month, my husband, he was reluctant to go at first, I must say. This isn't his type of vacation. He's the type of person that likes to go to the beach and lie in the sun. He's British. He likes to lie in the sun. The Brits love to lie in the sun and have, somebody serve him drinks and sort of. So when I said, how about walking for 20, 30 miles a day with a backpack? And it took some persuading. But this year, he turns 50. And I asked him what he wanted to do. And he said, I want to walk the Camino again. It really changed him, too. So.
And it changed you, and
changed
it
me.
gave you experience and knowledge and thoughts that you put in your books.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. I think that was the time as well when I really said to myself, no, I'm going to give this writing thing a chance. At the end of the Camino, you must sign a book. It's really fascinating because this is a place where people for 1,000 years have been going to register that they finished the Camino. I believe it's very close to the original office where people would go. And you must sign where you were from, I believe your age, as I said, the country you were from, and what you do. What is your profession? And it's the first place I ever wrote, I'm a writer. I should have put storyteller, but I thought writer. And I showed my husband, and I felt like I was trembling when I did that because I thought, I'm going to take the plunge. I'm going to do this. Yeah. And I'm glad I did.
Yeah. Other experiences of your own that you have put in your books is the experience of being a refugee, a migrant. What's your relation to Cuba? You were born in Cuba, but you don't have any recollections of it since you were very little when you left.
That's true.
Or when your parents have to leave.
I left Cuba when I was an infant, and I was born right during the midst of the revolution. And that was a very dangerous time in Cuba, a very precarious time, as any time there is a revolution of that degree in a country. And my parents had to flee, and we went to the United States and lived in California. So I have always had this sort of mystical and romantic notion of Cuba, and a very sad feeling in my heart. I grew up immersed in the sadness of having lost a country and having lost a culture through my parents. I mean, through my parents and my grandparents. And it was, for example, for holidays, we would get together as a family, a Cuban family. And music and dancing is very much a part of the Cuban way of life, and it is for our family. And so we'd move the furniture aside, and someone would turn Cuban music on, and we would start dancing. And invariably, my mother would run off. She's a very good dancer. And she would run off the dance floor and go to the kitchen, and my dad would follow her, and I would go see what was going on, and she would be weeping and weeping. And I thought, my goodness, this is a party, this is a great time, and what's going on? And I would ask, and I would, over the years, slowly get a picture of what had happened and why we were crying during these holidays, and why it was so different. So this was, sadness was a part of my life, but there was also great joy and opportunity, and just different pieces of what you live with.
And you had never the opportunity to go back.
Well, I cannot go back to Cuba, and it's much more difficult for Americans, as you may know, to travel to Cuba. And it's even more difficult, that changes, there are different laws that evolve, and so on, depending on the administration. So sometimes it's easier to go if you have family. I don't have any family left in Cuba.
You all left.
We all left, or the older members of the family died and never saw their family again. But the other reason it's difficult for me to go back is because I'm quite outspoken about my support for human rights and the dissident movement in Cuba, and the government is aware of that, and so it isn't. I wouldn't be welcome. They wouldn't want me there, and I don't want to take the chance because things happen to people there. You never know what could be.
Yeah.
Things happen, and you know, I like my life.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that this your experiences of coming from Cuba and growing up in America are typical migrant experiences? Is it the sorrows and the joys and the feeling of having lost something and longing back to something that you can't reach? Is you said that as a therapist you've met many people with perhaps more violent stories than your own.
Absolutely.
But can you see a pattern in that people who have been forced to leave their home countries or homeland for political reasons or economic reasons, is there a typical refugee experience, or is it all very individual?
Well, I think there definitely is the experience of loss, but I have to say I don't think there is a typical story. Each story is so unique, and one of the things that I have really been trying to figure out as I've worked with different refugees and immigrants from all over the world is how, as a therapist and even as a writer, what is it about certain people that they have this resilience and this ability to survive and even triumph despite horrific things that have happened to them?
Have you found an answer? Why are some people resilient?
I think I don't know. I think there may be many answers. I do have something I believe is I'm seeing there, but I will say that it was also very humbling for me to listen to other stories, because it made the experience that my family had seem like nothing in comparison to what people have suffered. But what I found, because there's some people, but there was one woman in particular who had been a child during the Civil War in El Salvador, and that was a particularly bloody, horrific civil war, and
very cruel.
Very cruel, and many families were, whole villages were sometimes massacred, and there was a clinic in Los Angeles that was worked with people. It was a holistic clinic, so it worked with people psychologically and medically, and even helped find housing and educational resources and jobs for refugees of El Salvador. And I worked there for a while, and I met incredibly courageous people, some who had experienced almost exactly the same thing. Some people were completely broken and lost, and you could see that they just had been beaten by this experience. And others were helping others. They had come through it. They had suffered, and they had certainly found a way to put the pieces back together.
By telling the story, would you say?
I think it was even more than that.
Believing in something bigger than themselves?
Yes. These were people that had some kind of a faith, a belief in, you could say, in some cases it was a religious or a spiritual belief. In some cases it was a belief that in the human spirit, in the goodness of life. They just had this inner sense of hope and belief, and that sustained them.
Perhaps as well.
Pardon me?
Some meaningfulness in it, or
well, they were striving. They felt that this, you can come through something like that and feel that life is just doesn't have any meaning at all.
Mm.
That what's the point? This random horrific cruelty that even though I hear the stories, it's hard to believe something like that. And nevertheless, they had this incredible ability to still believe in the goodness of humanity, in something greater than themselves, a strong spiritual faith. It seemed to make a very big difference.
Mm.
And I'm still trying to figure it out. I mean, that's the mystery of the human personality and psyche. You can never know all the pieces.
Mm.
But it's what a privilege to be exposed to the stories and have an opportunity to at least reflect on the possibilities of what it could be.
Mm. Mm. I have the impression, well, it's not me, but you get the image that we live now in a period of much migration in the world.
Mm-hmm.
In America, you have the movement from the southern Latino part to the north.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, we see immigrants from Africa and Middle East. What do you think that these, all these migrants, refugees coming to our affluent societies, what impact would that have on the society? Do you agree with me that we have more migration now than ever before?
Well, it certainly seems that way, and it's certainly become much more of a hot topic and a controversial topic now. And I think it goes in and out of sort of the news and popularity and focus. However, I do believe that we as human beings, I think we all know it, we're a migrant race, migrant species. We've been moving
out of Africa.
For 100,000 years or more. And that's sort of, it's in our genetics, it's in our DNA, and I don't think that's ever going to stop. We're always going to be flowing and moving and learning from each other.
So you think that now we're worrying about it and saying that this is a problem,
well,
but in fact it's nature.
I believe it's
or
just
culture,
natural.
whatever.
I think it's part of our humanity. It's
yeah.
part of our humanity, and there is, of course, there are political issues that get involved. We have lines around our countries and boundaries now, and they're defined in certain ways that they haven't always been, and that creates stress. And we're territorial people. I mean, we're a territorial species.
We're migratory and
we're territorial. Absolutely, and that's part of us.
Mm.
However, I think when we look historically at certain periods of time in our history, those communities and societies that have flourished have been those that have been the most tolerant, open, and curious about people who are different from them, and who have been, right now, actually, as I'm writing this final book to the trilogy, I'm looking at quite a bit that this time in history in Spain, that during the Moorish occupation of Spain, which was a wonderful, wonderful time. It actually was a time that many scholars believed paved the way for the Renaissance.
Mm. Mm.
And certainly there were phases that were more tolerant than others, but during the most beautiful, flourishing time of that period, when Spain was called Al-Andalus, that Moorish part, there was faiths, the Jewish were living with the Muslims and Christians, and there was a great openness and a sharing of ideas, and the society flourished in remarkable ways. And it wasn't until the Inquisition began, the Reconquista, and also the Berbers from the north became much more rigid, that things started to break down.
Mm.
Whenever a person or a society says, my view is the only view that's valid, I'm going to put nothing else counts, I think we fall apart.
Mm.
I think we fall apart as an individual,
Mm.
and I think societies tend to implode,
Yep.
and or at least become very stuck in their evolution.
So we shouldn't fear migration, just take the benefits of it.
Well, I know that's easier said than
Yeah,
done.
yeah.
I know it is a process, and it is change and differentness is scary. But ultimately, I think that is the goal, is to understand, to be open and willing to look at options, to be flexible. I always
Hello. One culture or one group of people who have made this innate human ability of migration their own is the Roma people, or gypsies they are called. In your books, there are many Roma people as strong characters, and I should like you to read so you can also hear how beautiful Cecilia writes.
Oh,
Could you?
you're so sweet.
Could you?
I would love
read
to.
us a passage on?
I would love to, but first I will tell you that I have always been fascinated by the gypsy people, primarily because I think there's such mystery and misunderstanding around the people. In fact, the Roma people don't have much of a written history of their own, which is actually great for a fiction writer, because you can start creating your own ideas, and nobody's going to tell you you're wrong, because there isn't anything that says otherwise. In Spain, the gypsy people are called gitanos, and to some extent they distinguish themselves from the Roma people, but they really aren't different. They come from the same origins, which they realize now is from India. And if you didn't know, gypsy comes from the word Egyptian, because at the beginning people thought that the gypsies were from Egypt, because they thought there's the most exotic, distant place we can think of, so they must be Egyptian, and they use that word themselves, but they really they are from northern India. And in this section of the novel that I am going to read to you, a young girl has been exposed to the same kind of degradation and criticism of the gypsies that most of us have been. I know I was. And she at first believes it. She's afraid of them. She knows that they will put a curse on you, give you the evil eye, that you have to be careful and stay away from their camps because they'll steal you away and maybe have you for dinner or something like that. And yet she's curious enough to sneak away from the village and go take a look at one of the camps herself to see what develop her own opinion. And so this is what she finds. Everybody in Sombrevista knew where the Gitano camp was, but nobody ever went there. Although I'd heard say that sometimes young men would venture down to the camp at night in search of entertainment, as it was rumored that the most beautiful Gitana girls were not allowed to leave the camp to engage in the mundane business of bartering, fortune-telling, or trinket-selling. These beauties were kept safely within the fold of the tribe for other purposes which were unknown to me. What little I knew about the Gitanos, I'd learned through snippets of conversation I'd collected here and there, and most of it was critical rather than informational. When people had anything to say about these mysterious people, it was to disparage, curse, and wish the government well in getting rid of them. So I didn't ask questions, knowing they would only be met with disdain. And if truth be told, I wasn't particularly interested until the day the Gitana told Manuela about my cape of blood. I'd been near a Gitano camp only once before, when traveling with my family to Orense for a funeral. I was very young at the time, but I remembered catching a glimpse of brightly colored wagons reminiscent of a carnival. My mother immediately forced us to look away. "Don't let them see you," she said. "If we show too much interest, they'll think we have something to steal." And she took off her pearl earrings and stuffed them into her mouth. My father later joked that the Gitanos must possess very great power, because they were able to suddenly transform his garrulous wife into a quiet and agreeable woman. I took one of several narrow goat paths that I thought might lead to a place where I could look down upon the camp without being spotted. And even as I made my way there, I didn't understand why I was going. If my mother found out, she'd scold and punish me with a sound beating that I would certainly deserve. I needed to come up with a plausible excuse for venturing so close in case I was discovered. I could say that I'd heard someone calling for help from down below and that I went to lend a hand. Yes, this would work. And I prayed that God forgive my curiosity, which led to this multiplicity of sins. Now I understood what the priest meant when he said that one sin leads to another and then to another until we are ensnared within Satan's evil web. You are the devil's most trustworthy accomplice, he said, his eyes burning. And at that moment, I could only agree. But despite all these guilty thoughts running through my head, my steps didn't falter as I made my way down the hill. My heart was pounding as I squeezed into a small space between several large boulders surrounded by trees. From this sheltered spot, I was certain that no one would be able to see me from above or below. I moved the foliage aside and saw a small clearing surrounded by woods, and in the middle of this, 20 or so brightly painted caravans arranged in an uneven circle. Just as many stocky horses grazed peacefully amongst them. It was a wonder to me that these dirty, evil people everyone was so afraid of should live within such tidy structures that sparkled like cherished toys scattered on a carpet of green. Older children played in the tall grasses as the periphery of the camp, and the smaller children slept on blankets laid out in the shade. Several fires were burning, and sweet-smelling smoke rose up through the trees. One of the men softly strummed his guitar, and several of the women prepared food near the fires. I heard laughter and pleasant conversation, and the mood was tranquil and relaxed. Then the man who was strumming his guitar began to sing in a haunting, melodious voice. I was unable to make out his words, but the melody had a longing quality, as though he were lamenting a lost love or yearning for a lover he had yet to know. And as he sang, the children began to gather round, and the women started to clap their hands in a soft, rhythmic manner. The gitana with the amber eyes emerged from one of the caravans, and as soon as she descended the steps, she began to dance on bare feet, with her arms outstretched and her face turned toward the sun. Her joy was infectious, because soon other women joined her, and several of the children too, and together they danced to this beautiful music, and I couldn't understand it. I would have stayed until the sun set to see if at night there were exotic rituals more in keeping with the sinister dealings I heard about all my life. Perhaps I'd see gitanos dancing naked by the light of the moon and making bloody sacrifices to their gods. I wondered about this and more, but I couldn't risk delaying too much longer. My mother and Manuela would start looking for me soon, and there was much work to do at home. I left my hiding place and made my way back up the goat trail to the dark gray stones of Sombra Vista. And that evening, when I closed my eyes to sleep, I saw the brightly colored caravans, and I heard the beautiful music that had stayed with me all day. In that cusp between wake and sleep, where dreams are woven of the best and the worst our souls have to offer, it occurred to me that everything I'd heard about the gitanos, that they were murdering thieves who carried disease, that they were backward and dense, that they lived like a dusty herd of animals moving from place to place, that they would sell their souls for a single coin, that all of this and more was simply untrue. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I can't ask you to tell me what happens next, but why did you choose that part of the book? It tells us that.
I think I think it's important for us to always develop our own opinions, to expose ourselves directly before we assume that what we hear is true. And there isn't anything more powerful than our own eyes, our own ears, and to directly see. And I think this character, Rosa, is, she feels guilty that she's curious and that she wants to figure it out for herself.
But you shouldn't be. You should be curious. You should try to get to know the other.
Yeah. And it can be scary sometimes, because you know that you're probably what you've always heard and what you've always thought will be challenged. And we're very comfortable with thinking that, most of us, that we know how it all works, and we know what the reality is, and we know what the truth is. And so often when we expose ourselves to the real thing, our notion of what's true and right and wrong is challenged. But when we do, we become better for it. And certainly this is just the beginning of Rosa's exposure to these people who have frightened her and who have frightened her family so much. So I wanted to share it.
So thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you.
And thank you, Eric. It was so great to have you here.
Oh, it was wonderful. And thank you all for listening so attentively. It really feels good.
Now the audience have the possibility to buy your latest book in Swedish, translated into Swedish, and also to have it signed. Mitt namn är Jenny Högström och jag är koordinator för Internationell författarscen. Jättekul att ni kom ikväll. Nästa tillfälle för Internationell författarscen blir den 22 oktober. Och då kommer Kim Thuy och samtala med mig på Litteraturhuset som öppnar imorgon. Och ett extrainsatt tillfälle på Internationell författarscen i höst blir den 30 november, då Peter Nadas kommer till Litteraturhuset för att samtala med Ingrid Elam. Ni är mycket välkomna då. Sen skulle jag också hälsa från Basar förlag att jag vet inte vad du sa där i början, men Cecilia har i alla fall kommit ut med 4 böcker på svenska. Och om det är någon som är intresserad av att skriva upp sig på Internationell författarscens mailinglista, så lägger jag ett papper och en penna här framme. Tack för ikväll. Hej då.